gravity. Under the motion, the South believes that the international community should welcome the rise of Chinese global hegemony. I now invite the Prime Minister to start the debate. Whenever you're ready.
In a world where globalization simply means that we become more and more Western-centric, and we force countries with diverse value systems to increasingly liberalize their economies, political systems, and societies, we think that Chinese hegemony is a welcome counter-influence to the forces of the West. We believe as the international community, we are thrilled that China is being taken as a counter-influence to the Western hegemonies of the United States, the European Union, and even Russia, in establishing their traditional values can also find a place to belong in the vast world we live in. This is a value judgment debate in which we will evaluate if the existence of Chinese global hegemony presents greater benefits to dynamics of international relations as opposed to the complete absence of any Chinese influence. We will take up two burdens to prove in this debate today. Firstly, we will prove that the counter-influence provided by the Chinese hegemony provides greater checks and balances against Western pressure. Secondly, we will prove that this allows nations in the global community to preserve their value systems to a greater degree. Proving these 2 points, we would like to propose. And we have three arguments for you today. Firstly, the Chinese hegemony provides necessary counter-influences against the Eurocentric pressures in the global community. Secondly, the Chinese hegemony is a gateway for more nations to defend their values and their policies and their own national values. Thirdly, why welcoming China's influence will only create stronger and get rid of any potential harms associated with the Chinese hegemony. Now let me move on to my first argument. As the world continues to modernize under the leadership of Western nations, we also have given them the power to further shape the values of the international community in accordance with their value systems and their way of life. Although we agree to the world that we should have a minimum standard for universal human rights, the hegemonies of the US and the EU go too far beyond that. There are three aspects that those hegemonies unfairly punish nations in the international community who does not abide by them. Firstly, through a political aspect, many nations across the world have not yet embraced a democratic governance and are increasingly pressured to do so through these hegemonies. And we believe that since they are waged in order to install democracies, such as example by Iraq, done by the US, we believe that there is no definite universal consensus that democracies are the best form of governance in the world. And if we look at an absolute monarchies such as Brunei, no thank you, when there is zero poverty, low crime rates, and a higher universal income for every citizen, we believe that only even socialist states like China have become the biggest growing economy in the world, and they can be the counter-influence that we are looking for, or the rather Eurocentric Western side of the US or the EU. And secondly, through an economic aspect, the United States and the European nations all believe in the liberalization of the economy as well as free trade agreements and whatnot, and they increasingly pressure all their allies to actually follow this. This does not provide an objective economic benefit for their developing countries that require protectionist policies in order to spur local growth and protect local brands. Yet, they have been increasingly successful in pushing the international community towards the free trade, which is not beneficial for all of the community. Though their control in the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, they provide loans and aids to countries with the condition that the protectionist economy in Asia will actually liberalize their economies, right? They are actually giving these aids in order for the exchangement of actually liberalizing or becoming a democracy. We see that the US hegemony is so strong that if they engage in these actions, for example, in South Korea, they were able to aid by also causing these actual other countries and other members of the international community to actually democratize and liberalize without their consent and without much of the actual further needs of the countries or whatnot. And thirdly, through a social aspect, these Western forces to demonize the value systems and way of life in many traditional or conservative nations. The whole point of sovereignty is to allow nations to state their own moral standards and whatnot, but we believe that because of the Western influences and the Western powers actually imposing democracy, liberalization on the other international community members, we believe that this is not being achieved within the current status quo, and therefore we need a counter-influence, which in this case is China. And in the absence of China, we don't have any other hegemonic power to provide a counter-narrative to these forces. The presence of China shows you that you don't have to succumb to these influences in order to be a superpower with international relations. Furthermore, as the West fears, that more and more nations will embrace China if they continue to alienate more of the traditional allies, this has made the Western forces become more and more moderate. And we believe that the Chinese hegemony creates other examples, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, as a countermeasure to aid provided by the IMF, which allows nations to develop with their own needs in the center, not the other hegemony or liberalization or whatnot coming from the Western side. So we believe that since China provides other methods, such as the AIIB, in which they can actually consider, the other nations consider their own needs, not just the liberalization and the forcing of the democracy of the Western-centered hegemonies, we believe that this is an effective counter-influence to alleviate this problem. And secondly, the Chinese hegemony is a gateway for most nations to defend and preserve their own national values. As I said before China, there has never been an effective hegemonic defense against the Western way of life. And we see that since we need an actual counter-influence that is strong enough, in which that can actually provide an aid that is fair for the nations, in which the nations can fit for their own need, we believe that China is actually the real hegemony that can actually provide this as a counter to the Western side. We see that since there are the P5, such as UK, France, US, and Russia, and now China, we believe that out of the P5, only China is the one that is against the Western-centered values, and they can actually provide a diversity in opinion to these standards or whatnot, and actually cause a change in which we can actually have a more diverse view upon the international community and see which needs can be balanced or whatnot. And the absolute success of the Chinese hegemony, which is signified by China being the biggest trader in the world, not only next to the EU, which is a whole block of nations, has empowered other countries with more traditionalist values to preserve their own values. And it shows to them that the global community is diverse enough for non-Western nations to find acceptance and more powerful in their own right. We believe that China is the actual one, the only one out of the P5, the powerful nations within our world, in which they can actually provide a counter-influence, a counter way to go with the nations, not just democratization, liberalization that is being forced upon these nations through the Western value and the Eurocentric nations such as the US, UK, or the EU, and therefore we are proud to propose.
May I now invite the leader of opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to deny the core characterization of the premise on the government side. The government side seems to believe the United States is giving such bad influences, that they're forcing democracy to other countries, that they're pushing other countries to follow the exact ideology that they have. We deny this characterization. Why is that? It's because the United States is putting limitations to countries in which they have radical political views, in which they oppress their own citizens as a government. We think that when those sort of problems, when those sort of imminent problems are existing within those countries, the United States have more justification to actually implement their push. But furthermore, they give us an Iraq example about how the United States are actively engaging with Iraq. We think that this actually supports our case, because Iraq were actually posing threats using nuclear weapons. When these sort of imminent problems are externally existing, we think that it's more than justifiable for the United States to actually intervene to those countries for the sake of global community. But furthermore, they stated the United States they gave economic pressures. We think that this is actually not mutually exclusive when we talk about China, because actually China forces other countries to build factories within those countries in order for them to extract the most benefits out, and they don't really care about the labor rights, which will be further elaborated in my arguments. And they stated that democracy is not like that. Most Western-centric countries are forceful. However, we say that there are lots of other unconditional aids are not being given. We say that IMF is not the only way for those sort of aids to be provided. With that being explained, I'd like to move on to my setup. We believe that this is also a valid judgment debate. The burden that side opposition will take in this debate is that the spread of the Chinese hegemony brings more harm than good to the international community. Proving this, we believe that the international community must not welcome the rise of the Chinese hegemony. Now to directly move on to the arguments that I have. Firstly, the influence of the Chinese government undermines basic human rights upheld by the international community, which the preview was already provided during our rebuttals. The international community has established a universal consensus and signed a Declaration of Human Rights, which are owed to every person regardless of their nationality. Yet, as one of the superpowers of the world, China continuously violates these universal provisions rather than assist the rest of the international community in effectively enforcing it. This is problematic because we do not have a system to enforce universal rights. Every nation is sovereign and has the right to rule in however way they want to. Therefore, we need the cooperation of nations to punish those who violate these international rules. We do so by cutting diplomatic ties, imposing sanctions, publicly condemning these nations, or in the worst case scenario, organizing intervention into their domestic politics. China ruins this international framework by utilizing their hegemony to validate their own way of governance, which is a systematic oppression of their own citizens. They freely abuse their legal system by administering capital punishment to those who they view as threats to their state power. They structurally oppress the economic and poverty rights of their citizens. They discriminate and torture Tibetans and Uyghurs, as well as deny Tibet, Macau, Hong Kong, and Taiwan from the ability to declare themselves completely sovereign from China. It is undeniable, ladies and gentlemen, that the Chinese government is one of the most consistent violators of human rights, and yet they have positive relations with the majority of the world and receive little to no punishment. Well, thank you then. By welcoming the Chinese hegemony, we are undermining the framework of enforcement for universal human rights. This will ultimately allow the Chinese government to spread their harmful way of life onto other nations when they spread their hegemony. The prime example of this is when China spreads their hegemony by giving immense aid and investment to African nations without setting conditions for its use to abide by labor rights or responsible governance. It ultimately results in funding corrupt African regimes as well as setting up industries that flagrantly abuse its own workers. Factories utilize child labor. Workers are made to work in hazardous environments and they do not receive adequate compensation. As an international community, we cannot stand by legitimizing China's violations of human rights, of universal rights, and spreading that chaos to other nations as well. Secondly, the Chinese hegemony nullifies international actions against oppressive nations. In order to spread their hegemony, China must offer something to nations in order to root their influence within them. So, China offers economic aid or trade, military with the majority of the world, and receive little to no punishment. Well, thank you then. By welcoming the Chinese hegemony, we are undermining the framework of enforcement for universal human rights. This will ultimately allow the Chinese government to spread their harmful way of life onto other nations when they spread their hegemony. The prime example of this is when China spreads their hegemony by giving immense aid and investment to African nations without setting conditions for its use to abide by labor rights or responsible governance. It ultimately results in funding corrupt African regimes as well as setting up industries that flagrantly abuse its own workers. Factories utilize child labor. Workers are made to work in hazardous environments and they do not receive adequate compensation. As an international community, we cannot stand by legitimizing China's violations of human rights, of universal rights, and spreading that chaos to other nations as well. Secondly, the Chinese hegemony nullifies international actions against oppressive nations. In order to spread their hegemony, China must offer something to nations in order to root their influence within them. So, China offers economic aid or trade, military support, and political alliances in order to establish a relationship of dependency with other nations. If those nations rely on China in some shape or form, this allows China to impose certain demands on those nations or shape their decisions by exerting some pressure on them. Thus, in their effort to spread the Chinese hegemony, China uses their massive economic and military resources to buy favor from other nations. This becomes extremely problematic when they provide economic and military resources to nations that pose a dangerous threat to global safety, such as North Korea, or to nations that have made significant violations of human rights, such as Syria. Those nations are structurally punished through a global cooperative effort by placing economic sanctions or cutting diplomatic ties with them. This is done to exert political pressure so that these nations reform their cruel ways, or even to the extent of Iraq, that has been actually sufficiently provided on their side. However, this political pressure can only be successful if the entire global community is united in imposing this. Only when there is complete economic or diplomatic isolation will there be an acute threat to the survivability of the state that they will be forced to reform their governance or abhorrent policies. In expanding the Chinese hegemony, China provides economic and military sustenance to sanction states like Iran, North Korea, and Myanmar that nullifies our international effort to reform them. As China is a global powerhouse, trade and military ties with China alone is sufficient to sustain them so they continue their oppressive ways. Additionally, China also extends their political hegemony by doing favors for these problematic allies. We see this when they casted 4 vetoes to United Nations resolutions over the last few years that are meant to sanction and punish Syria for their human rights violations. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council, China has the power to overthrow the majority vote made by the General Assembly, which is composed of the rest of the international community. In conclusion, every effort we make in trying to ensure global safety and save global citizens are being nullified by China in their effort to protect their hegemony. We must not welcome the rise of the Chinese hegemony. Thank you.
Thank you. I now invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, simply saying that human rights and simply saying that democracy is the most important value all nations should have on is really assumptions, right? Because we think that what China has done in sacrifice of human rights is much more beneficial than what the United States has done to begin with, right? And not only that, even assuming the fact that China has so many interventions that agree with human rights or that go against human rights, Mr. Speaker, we think that this is not a debate whether or not China or the United States is perfect, right? Because we think that all regimes have their own flaws, but the way they conduct their type of ideas, the way they conduct, if that brings more practical benefits, this is when we think that China should be recognized as a hegemony in its way today, right? And directly moving on to revolts that the previous speaker had to keep on talking about. The previous speaker has to keep on talking about how the United States is forcing democracies, and why that's not wrong to begin with, right? Because they're putting limits to a country with radical views. But Mr. Speaker, we think that it's extremely wrong to just say the United States puts limits to only countries with national views, right? Because Mr. Speaker, first of all, let me give you an example of Nicaragua. We think that the United States always changed their stance based on what benefits they want to have. What does this mean? In Nicaragua, the United States changed a democracy or socialist government that every people and every person in that certain country likes, but just because the United States disliked that certain country, what happened was that what happened is that they suddenly changed it into dictatorship, right? This is what this means, right? Socialist people wanted the government and they liked the government, the status quo, but the United States still went against it. So we think that it's assumptions to suddenly say that the United States only makes good choices. And not only that, we think that the United States imposed FTA in Mali, but because the United States wanted to protect their own agricultural industry, we think that what they did went against their own values, right? What they did is that they only put tariffs on the imported products that have to do with agriculture and basically cheated on Mali and went against their own democratic principles. So is it really right and rational to say that the United States is such a good country? Or is it necessary, or does this only prove that there needs to be another check and balance that happens only when China is, right? Not only that, we think that China is the only capable people because we think that the United States has so much debt from China. Over 60% of its debt is on China. We think that this is the best way China can create check and balance, right? That's exactly why if the United States cannot do whatever it wants in China, we think that that's extremely effective. And moving on to the next revolt, they said, first of all, we think that they had no response to our second argument, and we clearly told you that it's so hard, right? And not only that, they talked about why the declaration of human rights is so important, but rephrasing again, we think that human rights is not always a priority, right? Because we think that what China has done, okay, they went against human rights, but why is that not the best thing? Because, Mr. Speaker, we think that what China did instead was that they increased so many people from the poverty line. What they did in countries like Africa is that they increased people from poverty line and gave them life and gave them money to sustain their lives, Mr. Speaker. So we think that when should we always, we think that simply always making human rights is not the best solution. And we think that simply, if you don't have life to begin with, and if you don't have sustainable income or economy without Chinese subsidy, these people won't be able to sustain having human rights to begin with. Right? So we can't simply say that China is doing something wrong. And yes.
We don't believe that's true because IMF and the European Bank is not the only stakeholder who provides the money from Eurocentric countries, but rather there's United Nations who are actually giving the unconditional support you're talking about, so we believe China should not be out of it.
No, it's not that. Because we clearly told you about the United States, just because they want to have human rights, and all the countries that they have hegemony over, in Africa, they're still suffering from poverty, right? People are dying, Mr. Speaker, in places like Africa that the United States has come over, so we think that simply saying that there's other check and balances does not make any sense. And also, they keep on talking about why China puts Africans unfair policies such as making factories or whatever. Mr. Speaker, we think that this is also wrong because we think that, like I told you, even if it can be unfair, this actually boosts the economy and saves these people's lives to begin with, right? And not only that, in their second argument, they talk about why China doesn't intervene. But we also haven't heard a clear analysis of why intervening is the best solution. We think that what happened is that when Iraq was intervened by the United States, what this created ISIS, which killed so many people and violated so many human rights, right? So we think that we can't simply say that intervention is the best solution. No, thank you. And not only that, we think that the United States doesn't intervene in Somalia as well, right? Not only that, the United States said that they didn't want to intervene into Syria even after there has been chemical weapon usage. So we think that this simply also proves why the United States is also not willing to intervene into some types of human rights, right? So we simply think that the United States is not the best actor. Now, in regards to the previous speaker's arguments, we're going to move on directly to our arguments. Thirdly, why welcoming China's input will mitigate any potential harm associated with the Chinese hegemony. We agree that China is not the most benevolent actor in the world, and they have their own series of misdoings, but no country in the world is without faults, right? Site government believes that opposing the Chinese hegemony will worsen the state of international relations, and to welcome the Chinese hegemony will result in a far healthier global community. And why is that? The reason why China is so insistent in expanding their hegemony efforts is because they feel threatened that the extremely successful Western hegemony does not favor their own position in the world. The more paranoid China and the more alienated China feels, the more they will resort to spreading their influence in the only countries willing to listen to them, the Europe countries like North Korea, Iran, and Myanmar. The poor, they provide economic ties to radical nations that are being economically isolated from the international community, and this is what motivates China to even help them in the beginning, right? So we think that as soon as we accept China's hegemony, they will have to resort to this. And not only that, in recent years, we see that China has become more and more moderate. They are increasingly distancing themselves from rogue nations and the rest of the world, and they have been more welcoming towards Chinese influence, right? The increasing membership and investment in AIIB, which is an investment started by this Chinese government, has allowed them to feel secure in China's position as a leading hegemon. This is significantly beneficial to the international community, and our welcome allows us to moderate China's action and guide China into using their superpower for good purposes. Not only that, with South Korea being one of the investors and leading investors in AIIB, we see that China increasingly snubbing North Korea by choosing to make diplomatic visits to South Korea instead, condemning North Korea's nuclear arms possession, as well as slowly cutting down their ties with North Korea. Another prime example of moderating China is when we see President Xi Jinping switch support from militant Burmese government to democratic opposition leader Aung San Suu Kyi. As soon as Myanmar has transitioned to a new government, China has reduced the diplomatic efforts and support the need to Burmese democracy. This moderation was only possible in light of Asian nations' strong economic ties with China, and we believe that this is the only reason why and only way China can become more moderate and status quo, right? And we believe that this is the reason why we're very proud to propose in this paper. Thank you.
We'd like to prove to you in Team Opposition that China is not the only hegemony in today's debate that can adequately be represented to go against USA. We told you that there are other hegemonies in today's debate, such as EU or Asia, and we'd like to further elaborate on today's debate why they are more capable than China, a nation that bypasses human rights for the justification of better economy on which they benefit. I'd like to further elaborate on you why it is in today's debate that there's justification for China not to be a global hegemony. But to go on to my rebuttals, they said that we first proved to you that China always goes against the United Nations Security Council, for example, against Al-Assad. For example, when US wanted to invade Al-Assad for their chemical warfare usage against their own citizens, China used their veto powers in the United Nations Security Council to claim it as justification because they don't believe that there wasn't necessary to attack. This was wrong. US was justified because they were using biological warfare on their citizens, but simply China's veto power was because they were selling weapons to Syria. We like to tell you that China is a nation who doesn't care about their reputation. China is a nation that only cares about self-preservation benefits. China does not believe in the understanding of R2P. We'd like to further elaborate on today's debate that Eurocentric nations that also does give aid, and there's also that is why they are a tangible counter-solution in today's debate. So 3 levels of analysis on that Eurocentric nations does not give aid. Firstly, we tell you that they do give aid in the cases of, for example, unconditional aid. United Nations, for example, gave money to African nations in return for unconditional aid. Secondly, we like to tell you that this is, even if it wasn't unconditional aid, we don't think it is a big problem because they want to implement democracy in the first place, and it cannot be denied from Team Opposition in today's debate that democracy in itself is bad because there were many examples in times where democracy actually benefited the world. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, we like to tell you that democracy is not the only considering factor in today's debate. We also told you that when these Western nations gave money or aid, for example, if it did not go to the citizens, then these aids were cut. So we like to tell you that China, on the other hand, does not care about this. China, on the other hand, does not care about the checks and balances. We told you, for instance, that when China when China spends money in Africa, for instance, we told you that they bypass human rights laws, the international human rights laws, to justify what they say is benefiting the economy. And we don't think that is a legitimate stance in today's debate to prove to you that just because China is bypassing these human rights, that they're justified in today's debate to do all the benefits that they game. So further on, Mr. Speaker, we'd like to also rebut cases of proposition and why they actually didn't understand today's debate. Let's talk about, no thank you, let's talk about reputation. We told you that China does not care about reputation. For example, North Korea. They don't care if they support rogue nation, because as long as they have political influence and political power, then they believe it is justified and any means is necessary for them to be strong. But Mr. Speaker, US does. US has a checks and balance. Mr. Speaker, we told you that US has international arenas or international relations with other nations, right? And that is why for them, checks and balance is so important, because they actually care about their own reputation. But Mr. Speaker, for example, it doesn't exist in China. Checks and balances don't exist in China because they oppress their human rights without caring about their reputation. So in a global hegemony, Mr. Speaker, we like to define that global hegemony as a characterization that proposition does not understand. Global hegemony is a unity in idea. A unity in idea, firstly. But secondly, we also like to tell you that they are also a global police. What is the use of a global police if they bypass all the points and they don't care about the ideas that the Western nations claim, such as human rights? It cannot be denied from team proposition in today's debate that these human rights are very important, right? And human rights are a central idea that we all agree on. So according to that logic, Mr. Speaker, we'd like to tell you that China, in the instance, doesn't care about these ideas. So they actually are not a global police in the sense that they have no principal role, they have no principal justification in today's debate to actually succeed in being partial, right? No, thank you, sir. We'd also like to tell you in today's debate, so that is why, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to today's debate, we want to provide a counter-narrative. There are plenty of nations out there, plenty of banks out there that are willing to give these aid or willing to counter the Western influence, for example, US. We like to tell you, no, thank you, sir, that in the case of today's debate, there are other nations, other examples that our first speaker clearly gave and identified in today's debate. For instance, we told you that there are UN that gives unconditional aid, right? But we told you that not only UN, but there are other like AIIB, or no, not AIIB, but other instances in which we told you that there are possible ways or methods to solve the US hegemony from over-influencing or over-influxing in today's debate. So that is the characterization we'll have. Thank you. And I'd like to go into my third argument in today's debate. The Chinese hegemony functions with zero regard to the interests of other nations in the international community. Healthier types of hegemonic powers offer something back in exchange for strategic influence. We don't necessarily believe that hegemonies per se are harmful, but we do believe that Chinese hegemony specifically is harmful to the international community. If we examine other hegemonies like the US that offers political and economic and military support towards other nations, it is also done to secure the best interests of those nations. Small nations like Palau and Marshall Islands rely completely on US military for protection, as well as nations with no standing army like Japan. Not to mention that the US military is most often used to protect vulnerable allies under threat, such as South Korea, who are facing constant aggression against North Korea, for the Philippines, whose islands are being invaded by China. All these nations will either fail or be under severe threat if the US has not stepped in the military support. Granted that this strengthens the US hegemony, but it also protects the interests of other nations. Those are the case of spread of Chinese hegemony. They are biggest traders in the world, but within those trade ties, they actively victimize every other state. China actively manipulates their own currency and deliberately depreciates the value of Chinese yuan in order to make exports more economically competitive in other countries. The reason why every single cheap stored item that is made in China is because China makes their products incomparably cheap. To add on to that, they allow for oppressive labor laws with dangerous working environments, exhaustive hours, no minimum wage, and lack of corporate taxation laws in order to attract more economic investment into China. China also clear disregard to the welfare of any other in the global community if it means that it is sidelined to their own personal interests. To welcome the type of hegemony would be morally complicit into the victimization of other states as well as the oppression of Chinese citizens. But also, additionally, China uses their extensive power to forcefully impose their hegemony onto other nations where they do not concede against them. The primary example being China's territorial dispute in the South China Sea against Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Vietnam, and Taiwan. China claimed a large portion of South China Sea that encroached into the exclusive economic zones of all other nations. The most aggressive of China's military actions is to physically invade some of the most affected islands under Filipino sovereign control and setting up intimidating naval bases surrounding all of the islands in order to block access. China's gone too far as to be an illegal island. China's gone too far to illegally build islands in the South China Sea surrounding the disputed territories and claiming that the new islands expand to the exclusive economic zones of China. That is why we don't believe that China is about adequate hegemony to counter USA. Thank you.
So Mr. Madam Speaker, I'd like to tell you that this debate is not necessarily about whether China's reputation is good or whether China's reputation is bad, as we're not selectively choosing between China and the United States. Mr. Madam Speaker, this debate is most primarily centered around whether adding another international layer to our international community is beneficial in the first place. And therefore, having clarified what our burden of the debate is to prove, let me move on directly to two clashes I have in today's debate. First clash, are we justified to acknowledge China as another hegemony in the first place? Second clash, what is the social implications, practical benefits, and harms that comes with this acknowledgement? So having clarified those two issues, let me move on directly to this first clash regarding the idea of justification. So Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, we told you that there is a clear, tangible problem in the status quo, as global development itself is only contingent upon the standard of accepting Western values. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, we think that that itself deprives of every country to maximize their own values to the greatest extent. Because, Mr. Speaker, we told you that if they are being forced into accepting these kind of Western values in the first place, that are not always beneficial for them, and that cannot practically guarantee certain type of benefits. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, we told you that itself is a clear, tangible problem that is existing in the status quo. But they said that other nations can counter the United States influence. They gave us that example of UN, right? First of all, Mr. Speaker, the fact that UN is made by the United States and those kind of nations, we think first of all that can never be the best counter-narrative in the first place. Why we say that, Mr. Speaker, is that China itself is an exclusive counter-narrative. It has the greatest, its economy is boosting and its population is increasing every minute. And second, Mr. Speaker, its values are directly opposed against the United States, which is actually an effective counterbalance in the first place. Third of all, Mr. Speaker, it's best representative of Asian values and Middle Eastern values in the first place. And therefore, with its similar capacity when it comes to military capability, we think therefore China is the most best viable option when it comes to countering the United States influence and Western influence. No, thank you, sir. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, we think that is why China is different, because it diversifies the spectrum of these companies, of these countries that actively choose the hegemony that they believe would develop their country in the best way in the first place. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, we also proved to you that. The second, we also told you that this debate is not about absolute hegemony that is good, in this case that they characterize the United States, or absolute hegemony that is bad, as they characterize as China. Mr. Speaker, we would like to tell you that every hegemony, as we told you before, is relatively good and relatively bad in many ways, meaning that every hegemony has structural flaws in a way. And therefore, we gave you the example of how the United States bombed Yugoslavia and Syria. Second, we told you the China hegemony harm is not mutually exclusive, because the actions of the United States also oppresses citizens across the globe in the first place. We gave examples of how the U.S. hegemony actively oppresses the people by funding political rebellions across the world. And we told you that they expand this kind of influence, their hegemonic power, by encouraging and inciting these kind of political rebellions in the first place and wars. And therefore, because of their own selfish interests, they try to eradicate the governments of other countries that they do not that does not listen to their interests, and therefore they replace it with a dictator that is completely abusive of certain type of human rights. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, we give you an example of Chile, and we think that that itself, the dictator that is replaced because of the government's intervention from the United States, has actually abused much more lives in the long run in the first place. And therefore, we don't think that the United States is always the best option. And second, we told you that the intervention into Iraq was actually a mistake, because, Mr. Speaker, what it caused is not a solving of these kind of conflicts, rather it caused only terrorist group that abuses global security, which is ISIS, right? And they never proved to us exclusiveness of why we necessarily need military intervention when it comes to solving conflicts, and we don't think that that is always the best approach in the first place. And therefore, also the United States does not intervene in Israel conflict in the first place, meaning that they're solely for their own interests, Mr. Speaker. They're not rather for the idea of global security, as we can see that there's so many counterexamples in which they do not intervene in the first place. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, we'd like to tell you that because the United States can check and balance the idea of China, China can also equally check and balance the idea of the United States. That is the exclusive benefit we have under our policy. And therefore, moving on directly to the second question regarding the idea of practical implications and social harms, right? So they talked about how the political pressure against these rogue nations can never be successful because of the Chinese hegemony. They said that China is actually being oppressive of the human rights again and supplies its gun military. First of all, Mr. Speaker, the only reason why China did that in the past is because they feel threatened when it comes to their own power within their own hegemony. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, because it's actually worse to not acknowledge them as a hegemony, because they will try to keep on doing and causing conflict in order to show their dominance and power. And Mr. Madam Speaker, rather that is not the solution. We should rather make sure that China does not feel threatened when it comes to the hegemonic power, and therefore, Mr. Speaker, we think that the better solution is to actually acknowledge them. Second, we also gave examples that China is actually willing to actively change in certain type of scenarios to become a global leader. Mr. Speaker, they actually tried to convert into nuclear power plants, meaning that actually we think that they are thinking of the global environmental standards in the first place, because we can see that that itself world is changing. And second, Mr. Speaker, we think that the idea of human labor conditions are actually increasing in China. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, just because of the past does not mean that we should influence our decision of China in the future. Because we told you, Mr. Speaker, that actually the idea of them actually cutting down certain type of relationships between North Korea is actually existing in the status quo. As they're gaining this kind of power and as they're gaining this kind of global acknowledgement, we can see many examples of China actually reforming into being a good leader. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, we think therefore it's actually okay for right now to accept China as hegemony. And second, Mr. Speaker, because we proved to you that exclusively the United States is actually causing the same problematic issues that they are presented in today's debate, we don't think that China itself is an exclusive harm. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, why we win this debate is simple. First of all, we give an option for certain types of countries. Mr. Speaker, FTAs, a free trade, can never always be the solution for certain types of countries who need to protect their infant industries and who need protection and policy to develop. And therefore, because of current status quo in which it pressured them into accepting FTAs, we think that itself is a problem, but that will not be a problem because they have the choice to opt into Chinese hegemony. Second, Mr. Speaker, because we proved to you that all hegemonies are flawed in some way, but they still have benefits because of the check and balance system existing in the status quo, we think therefore our policy is still legitimate, and therefore I'm more than proud to propose them.
So, Mr. and Madam Speaker, this House would kill millions of citizens and don't even care if aid goes directly to the citizens or not because of the factories of China is implementing in those countries. Exactly the motion which Team Proposition is proposing in today's debate. It was quite weird to listen to those examples of factory because we believe the government whip just conceded to the fact that China's reputation is actually bad, Mr. Madam Speaker. We believe just because you talking about factory doesn't give you justification to say China is a hegemony, Mr. Madam Speaker. We believe first we have to think what is hegemony. It's just giving the economical benefit hegemony, or if unity of the opinion really hegemony, Mr. Madam Speaker. We definitely believe that should be the concerning factor in today's debate, which their Team Proposition failed to prove us why China is active and China is the adequate and China is the legitimate state to be the global hegemony as the United States, Mr. Madam Speaker. So having that said, let's directly move on to what happened in today's debate. Number one, is China really necessary? So they talked about how harms we suggested is not important because the fact that there are two options itself is really important because of the accountability. But number one, Mr. Madam Speaker, we believe if that one option is very harmful and very distorted towards those citizens, then we believe it definitely should be demeaned, Mr. Madam Speaker. We believe if that's the case, we believe that any kind of value we're trying to preserve of the international society, such as human right, if every kind of human right is bypassed by China, we definitely believe that choice is a really healthy choice, Mr. Madam Speaker. Choice and two options can only be legit when that choice itself is really beneficial to the international society, which we believe Team Proposition failed how that benefit is going to the citizens of that country. Number two, when they talked about the aids and how the economical benefit to China is giving to I don't know. When they talked about how China should be counter-narrative because they believe that there should be accountability, we believe there are plenty of examples without China, there are actually cases where accountability and check and balance can exist. Mr. Madam Speaker, we talked about how EU criticized the United States when they did not engage in Syria in military action. We talked about how OPEC, when the United States actively demonized these Muslim people, OPEC criticized them, Mr. Madam Speaker. As ASEAN, also, they actually actively had trade among those Southeast Asian nations because they believe that United States hegemony isn't the case in their region, Mr. Madam Speaker. We definitely believe that the existence of China and the significance of the China being there is not really the case of today's debate. We rather believe what should be really considered in today's debate is the harm that China would give as a global hegemony. What would really happen if they become acknowledged as a global hegemony? What did they do to the reality in the society? That's the real thing that we should consider in today's debate, rather than what they talked about in today's debate, Mr. Madam Speaker. So we believe the reason why we talked about unity of opinion is really important is not because just like like, oh, Western values are good. We believe when political pressure are successful, there should be people united and actively sanctioned in one group and one opinion, Mr. Madam Speaker. And if they say two options are really good, because even in those Middle East Asia, thousands of citizens are dying, having two options for the government of those Middle East Asian countries itself is okay, we definitely believe that's not the case. If there is a wrong thing, then we should sanction as an international society. That's what responsible international society to do. But if China is bypassing every kind of human rights and not going to resolution in United Nations Security Council, we definitely believe that you cannot claim China as a really good global hegemony at this point, Mr. Madam Speaker. The reason why United States was acknowledged as a global police, uniting those opinions, having those effective sanctions when there are human rights abuse, Mr. Madam Speaker, we definitely believe the team proposition failed why China is really, really good at that point. Oh, thank you. So we believe, and then they talked about the economies, right? So that economy leads to the second touch point about the China's real influence. So they talked about economy, but why? Why at this point economy is really important? Number one, Mr. Speaker, we believe China also didn't do that for their national interests, right? We believe there is characterizing China as a superhero when United States is abusing the society. But we definitely believe that characterization should be denied in today's debate. Why? Because we believe China actively extracted those resources when they're setting factories. Giving that example already proves how China is actively harming those countries at the very first place. But second of all, when we talked about child labor or those kind of things happening in those countries, we believe who gets that benefit? If you actually build this factory, does that benefit go to goes to the citizens of those countries when child are constantly getting abused by China? If you're giving aid, who gets those aids? The government are getting the aid, not definitely the citizens. We definitely believe if that's the case, it's meaningless. You're talking about economy that China is trying to give and those economical benefit. We definitely believe what is really the considerable factor in today's debate is about those harms, Mr. Madam Speaker. That's the reason why we believe China should never be acknowledged as a global hegemony. But when we talked about how China manipulated currency, that is actually leading to our point of China is not caring about reputation. The biggest difference with China and those Eurocentric nations is that China don't care about reputation and these countries do, Mr. Madam Speaker. Why is reputation that important? Because if reputation is not important, they won't care if international society vastly criticizes China or not, Mr. Madam Speaker. And rather, Eurocentric countries do care about reputation, so that's the reason why if we vastly criticize, check and balance can always exist in US hegemony. That's the reason why we believe China hegemony is not a really good solution when you say, oh there should be counter-narrative. That's the reason why we believe China should never be acknowledged as a global hegemony. For those kind of reasons, I vote up that we take this debate.
The debate we had in today was, is China necessary or not? We told you firstly that China has multitudes of harm and thus they should not be regarded as a global hegemony, but told you that there are other narratives, other counter-narratives that we proposed to you, such as OPEC that criticized the US when demeaning Muslims, right? We told you that other counter-narratives mean that much more China is useless. If we can prove to you that China does more harm and does not match under the definition of global hegemony, then we don't and we shouldn't as the international community recognize China as a global hegemony. So first, let's talk about, is China principally correct to be a global hegemony? We first told you that the government side conceded that China is not a good actor, but their justification of saying this was that relatively they're a good actor, right? So first he's saying, is government conceding to the fact that if you disregard human rights when you build factories, violently engage in and build islands around South China Sea, and you're selling weapons, and you veto engagements on Syria because you're selling weapons to them, is that true definition of a principally correct hegemony? We don't think that is true. We tell you that China does not act to the interest of others. We told you throughout my argument today's debate that US is different. US acts not only for their global hegemony and for their hegemony power, they also act for the interest of others. For instance, South Korea. So we told you in this there was a negligent response from Team Proposition. So we told you that the difference between US and China exists in today's debate, and that's why China should not be recognized as a global hegemony. So Mr. Speaker, we also like to tell you reputation. A nation that does not understand reputation as an important value in the international arena believes, and we like to tell that in that very fact that we don't believe believe that that means that they should be a global police in today's debate. They shouldn't be a global hegemony in today's debate. However, Mr. Speaker, we told you the other counter-narrative, like EU and US, can unite people's opinions. They can unite people's opinions and have actual laws that actually have international laws regarding the most important value of necessity that we regard in today's debate. For example, human rights. We told you that in the cases if China is necessary or not, firstly we told you that the fact that China exists as a counter-narrative for other nations in the international community in itself is harmful. Because we told you as a government would clearly explain in today's debate, as well as I claimed in the DPM, that the fact that you have a secondary choice that is distorted in a sense is not beneficial, because this is not a right choice that we believe that nations should be having. And the fact that they can resort to a bad choice in the first place is something that we don't deem as a necessary importance. Right, Mr. Speaker? So we'd now like to go on to the point, because we already proved the point, that China does more harm in the global hegemony, and then we told you that there are other counter-narratives that can take over China, thus proving to you that China is a useless hegemony and should not be welcomed as a global hegemony. We'd like to tell you about the economy and influence, right? So team proposition characterizes today's debate that China is such an altruistic nation, they're such a superhero nation, because they come and help these economic unconditional aids when somehow US is already doing some harm, right? So Mr. Speaker, we'd like to first tell you that China is doing the same thing too. We told you that China's trying to extract resources from these African nations, and they're not doing it for an altruistic point of view in the first place. So all the characterization that team proposition has about the harms of government team in the first place, harms of USA also coexist with the harms of China in the first place. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, because this is not altruistic, we'd like to tell you that the forms of when they had the economical reaping or benefits was for China's benefit, right? And the problem with this is simple. We clearly distinguish to you that US has these global hegemony for a simple reason. They want to have a global police and protect their allies or whatnot. They want to protect and have democracy. China, on the other hand, only cares about their nation, only cares about the sovereignty and the benefits and influence of their nation. So without that regard, Mr. Speaker, we believe that China is even more selfish in today's debate. And because China is even more selfish, we don't regard them as a global hegemony, and that is why we are more than proud to oppose this motion. Thank you.
I invite the last speaker of the court.
Mr. Speaker and Madam Speaker, let me first of all clarify to you something that has been keep on coming up from the previous whip speakers, right? Mr. Speaker, what the previous whip speaker has been keep on talking about is that company and these types of factories that China builds is not going directly to the citizens. And Mr. Speaker, first of all, as this is coming from the whip, we see that it's unfair, so we're going to tell you the response, right? So first of all, what happened is that poverty rates decrease. This directly means that people have been benefited economically, right? And not only that, we clearly told you that 60% of the money that China invested trickled down to the citizens, which is also evidence that proves that China building factories actually help these people, right? And not only that, what does the United States do? Instead of building factories, they try to keep on having human rights, right? But what does that lead to? That leads to people dying because they're starving, because they can't grow economically, right? Mr. Speaker, simply assuming that human rights is the best solution is what the biggest policy officers is making this debate today, right? And not only that, another question brought up from the speaker. What is a hegemony? Even if we assume economic benefits, should it be important, right? And Mr. Speaker, that's the exact reason why I need to speak. Well, hegemony, if a country wants economic benefits or political, the country should be able to choose, right? But what happens when we only have the United States is that we only get to choose between something else. And that's why we need China if we want economic benefits over whatever, right? And we also told you why FTA only allows other countries to benefit and you cannot benefit your own local market. That's why that's also harm. That happened tonight from previous speakers. And Mr. Speaker, that's exactly how we think that now that we've clarified the previous speakers, we're going to move on directly to the proof that we have to prove to you in this debate today. So first of all, we have to prove to you in this debate today why we need two balances, right? We keep on talking about why there's a natural check and balance already, but Mr. Speaker, we think that if natural check and balance is already working, we gave you examples like Nicaragua and Mali, right? If there was natural check and balance, why would this have happened, right? Mr. Speaker, we think that something that proves that there is a natural check and balance is that the United States has intervened into 220 wars, right? As to just in a few years, right? And Mr. Speaker, that's exactly how we think that there is no real type of natural check and balance to begin with. As we told you that the United States created UNICEF, United States created these types of nations to begin with, and that's why they can manipulate whenever they want, which we clearly told you in our second speaker when we heard the response, right? And not only that, we clearly proved to you in our second answer argument, which we had heard no response as well, there was lack of engagement, and we clearly told you why forcing democracies is not always good, and why the United States doesn't always make a rational choice, right? This debate is not about whether upon which type of hegemony is better, but like we told you, this debate should be whether upon why two hegemony is better, which again has been responded from the previous speaker. That's clearly what takes me. And we clearly told you that our second thing that we have to prove to you is why should it be China? We clearly proved to you why the United States cannot do anything against China as they're on debt, which clearly has been rebutted. And we clearly told you why only EU and only China is good, because EU and other nations don't really go directly opposing to the United States to begin with. And we told you that China is the only capable actor. Not only that, we clearly told you why China is the only military and economically capable, so that's why China is the only type of people, right? But then what they stated is that China's corrupt, and that's the only reason why we should accept them, right? Mr. Speaker, we firstly proved to you why this is not mutually exclusive by giving you examples of United States corruption, but then they completely denied those examples. And not only that, we told you in our third argument that China is getting better and better, and their reputation is also increasing and increasing, right? So Mr. Speaker, as there was no response to the third argument, we clearly tell you that we can't simply say that China is a corrupt country to begin with, right? And that is why we proved both burdens of the Thank you.